You are informed that the year is 2025. That's what your phone says. Your calendar concurs. The world is precisely humming, from atom-synchronized clocks to satellites in the sky. What if it isn't, though? What if 3 centuries were added to time somehow, maybe in a subtle, crafty way, without anyone alive today noticing? Even the textbooks and professors succumbed to fatality of a 297-year patch of history that slid in like fake coins in a purse. Now, the thought may make you chuckle quietly. It seems absurd, perhaps unfeasible. Not remember it, not live it, and not hold onto it. Bishops, kings, courts, monks, scribes, and everyone else, we have faith. You blink slowly. The room is quiet and dark, yet it's someplace in the hallways of your thoughts. You start to move through corridors, lighted by candles, with whispers resonating and papers rustling. The tale was altered by someone back there, and you will discover who it is tonight. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Turn down the lights now. For that gentle background hum, you might want to turn on a fan. And let's take it slow as we embark on our journey tonight. It's not that the Dark Ages were violent, filthy, or low-tech. That's the odd thing about them. No, that is a myth from Hollywood. The true blackness, the absence of letters, structures, and proof is the problem. Sometime in the 7th century, a fog descends and doesn't clear until the 10th century, during which time there is quiet. You drag yourself like heavy snow through that quiet. Where are the army, the chronicles, and the kings? All of a sudden, 3 centuries seem abnormally thin. If these centuries were human beings, they would be intangible ghosts that exist only in name. Time itself starts to sway under your feet. A straightforward question was once posed by a German historian. If our dates are based on church records, which were created by powerful individuals, what if those men made a small alteration to the timeline? For example, to claim a prophecy fulfilled, to align a kingdom's birthday with the stars, or to make an emperor's reign appear to be divinely scheduled. The resulting notion is now known as the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that around 297 years of European history, that is, the years 614 to 914 AD, were either wildly erroneously dated, manufactured, or purposefully prolonged. Fabricated means made up, as in never happened. Hold on, take that in. Just imagine you're not being asked to proclaim your birth year useless or to panic. Imagine finding a blank wall behind the historical wallpaper that has been removed. Then what? The odd thing is that if you give it some thought, everything starts to make sense. Why is there so little archaeology to tell us about those years? What causes medieval documents to suddenly become fully literate? What causes the Eastern and Western chronologies to clumsily diverge? Why do we have fewer documents for 3 centuries under the Roman Empire than for only 1? All of this doesn't prove anything, but tonight, it isn't our goal. We are not here to demonstrate. Our purpose is to ponder. Imagine a castle from the Middle Ages. A fire is burning, the walls are cold, and a monk is transcribing the life of a long-dead emperor he has never seen with a weary quill. Peasants outside accept anything the priest reads out loud. Who could possibly disagree with him? As a result, the chronology becomes pliable, more like wet clay than rubber and is simple to manipulate, particularly when holy hands are used. According to one theory, time may have been purposefully added to the record by Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and a cunning court historian. Why? Prestige and heritage. It would sound magnificent if they could make their reign appear to have begun precisely in the year 1000. It would seem like a new golden age, divine favor, or destiny. The calendar, however, disagreed, so they moved it. The once practical lie now becomes official documentation. Texts are changed, charts are modified, and then the year 614 is suddenly followed by 911. However, they still consider your bones and body to be from the 1700s. When you consider how seldom we question the story of time, it seems ridiculous. Prior to Julius Caesar's reform, the Roman calendar was in disarray. In order to address Easter's drift across the seasons, even the Gregorian calendar, which was first used in the 1500s, had to lose 10 days, and no one became alarmed. The sun continued to rise. How would you know then if someone tampered with a few centuries? Your forehead eases. The question hangs in the shadows, but the room is still silent. Perhaps time is not a straight line. Perhaps it's a well-crafted illusion. Additionally, you might be the one looking behind the curtain tonight. You're still there, walking down old stone halls in the dim light of a flickering candle. 3. Males appear like shadows thrown by the dancing flame. Individuals so powerful and astute that they may have altered history itself, not with swords, but with dates. The moist air echoes with their names: Gerbert of Aurillac, Emperor, Pope, Scholar, Otto II, and Pope Sylvester I. You narrow your eyes. Otto stands erect, his robe laden with imperial emblems, an individual who aspires for his rule to encompass more than only conflicts and boundaries. He wants it to have lasting significance. Pope Sylvester II, beside him, takes long, deliberate breaths. An astronomer, mathematician, and former monk. The Pope used to be a scientist. Yes, he is aware of how calendars function and how they can be manipulated. And in the silence, Gerbert, the smartest of them all, turns the pages of Roman history, his fingers quivering a little not out of fear, but from the excitement of creation. They come to an odd agreement together. Otto aspires to rule in the 1000th year following the birth of Christ, not just for the sake of boasting, but also because the year 1000 had profound esoteric significance in medieval Christian thinking, including apocalypse, resurrection, and judgment. During such a period, ruling was cloaked with heavenly legitimacy. However, the dates were out of sync. It was not yet 1000, not even close, unless you just state that it is. The game starts at this point, silently, almost respectfully. A few documents are adjusted by the papal chancery. A coronation is performed by the imperial court. The change is lovely and subtle. Reinterpretation is sufficient. Forgery is not required. Nobody knows. Surely someone would notice, you would think. But consider this. Who else has a clock or a calendar, a document? You are a farmer in a village where the dates are determined by the season. St. Jerome's feast day, the harvest moon, and spring sowing. Time is measured in marriages, floods, and famine rather than years. The year doesn't matter to you, for we enter the year 1000. Either you cross your fingers and wait for the end of the world, or you cheer. In any case, you avoid conflict. The lie's attractiveness lies in the lack of opposition it encounters. Now, Otto, Sylvester, and Gerbert didn't believe they were lying to anyone. Not precisely. As long as the chronology benefited God's glory and imperial order, history was malleable in their eyes. What if a few obscure centuries were shifted? However, it's not as though they declared in front of a crowd, "We're deleting 297 years. Everyone, paper by paper, choice by decision, slowly, silently." Actually, it might have started out innocently enough. As the head of a divided realm, Otto desired unification. Gerbert. In Muslim Spain, where astronomy and mathematics were significantly more advanced than in Europe, he had studied. He was proficient in calculating solstices, eclipses, and star courses. He was also aware that dates in Europe did not correspond with the sky. But he questioned the calendar instead of the sky. Additionally, Pope Sylvester II was aware of prophecy and power. As God's earthly representative, Otto emphasized his own power by enveloping his reign with eschatological radiance. You matter forever. After all, if you are in power when the end of the world is imminent. In order to stitch together a new story, the three guys came close together and murmured over parchments. Some centuries were given new names, others might have been made up. Critics contend that this conspiracy hypothesis is overly dramatic, and that these men, despite their strength, were unable to change the course of European history. What if they didn't have to? Let's think about it. What if they only had to make a few minor changes to certain important documents? A list of rulers. That has been enlarged retroactively. A papal edict here, a royal charter there. History goes on to fill up the rest. It always does. Humans are adept at making connections between seemingly unrelated things. And when you connect those dots, an entire story comes to life. Students commit it to memory. It is defended by professors. It is carved into marble by churches. It turns out that shaping time is surprisingly simple. Naturally, Sylvester went away shortly after Otto, who was only 22 years old when he died. Gerbert vanished into the past. His genius was gradually obscured by ideology and dust. However, the updated timeline persisted. The worst part is still to come. After it's in the books, nobody wants to take it back. Fixing a 3-century mistake is akin to acknowledging that the whole basis of European chronology is flawed. Easter, tables would fall over. The days of feasts would change. The historians would freak out. New scripts would be required for tours leaders. Leaving it alone is easy. Your eyelids briefly flutter shut. You see Gerbert, Sylvester, and Otto sitting around a fire with their breath hazy in the chilly air. They think they are influencing eternity. They might be in their own way. However, you're standing on the brink of their existence, wondering what the world was like beyond that lapse in time, and whether your own life, which is so well planned and dated, may be equally adaptable. Now you wander into yet another, older room, this one with sundials, scrolls, and murmured calculations in dim, echoing chapels instead of emperors and popes. Time was not always a steady rhythm, you see. To decipher, it was a riddle. Calendars as well. Sacred, convoluted, and slightly suspicious calendars were puzzles. This is an interesting item. Christians battled to determine the precise date of Easter for centuries. This isn't some cutesy, church-related trivia. It was a major issue. Easter was required to fall after the first full moon following the spring equinox, but it also needed to follow scriptural tradition and ideally not coincide with Jewish Passover. So entire councils were called to debate the matter. The stars refused to cooperate, so they resorted to astronomy. Consider the writings of a revered Anglo-Saxon monk from the early 8th century. He attempted to reconcile astronomy and history, and in doing so, he implied, possibly unintentionally, that the timing wasn't quite right. His Easter tables are inconsistent. His myth is revised by later scribes. 800 years later, Gregorian reformers declare that in order to bring the calendar back into line with the seasons, 10 full days must be skipped. We had wandered that far. But hold on, after 1600 years, shouldn't there be a discrepancy of at least 10 days if the Julian calendar was slipping that much? According to that reasoning, centuries are being lost. That very disparity was noted by Herbert Illig, a contemporary timeline critic who established the phantom time theory. If Rome began counting in 45 BC, and the Julian calendar loses about 1 day every 128 years, then we should be 13 days off by 1582, when Pope Gregory fixed things, he inquired. However, we were only 10. Where did the 3 extra days and the 300 years go? Do you feel cold now? The math isn't the problem, it's the ramifications. What if time itself was only adjusted for the years that truly occurred? Could it be that the calendar had not strayed as far as it ought to have? For, in the first place, those phantom years had never passed. That's a whisper for bedtime. Nobody is willing to speak out loud. It's easy to doubt, though astronomy would undoubtedly reveal a period of time that has been lost. Particularly, right eclipses are extremely predictable, and they were remarkably accurately recorded by ancient Chinese astronomers. We should therefore be able to validate everything by projecting their findings onto contemporary star maps. However, we can't, not flawlessly. In the record, several eclipses appear a little odd. The timing is off. The trajectories do not coincide. It is dismissed by astronomers as a result of scribal error, poor translations, or changes in the Earth's rotation. However, you start to question, what if the stars weren't the ones that moved? Could it be the years? The Easter tables then come back to haunt us at this point. Throughout Christendom, they were among the oldest and best maintained instruments for measuring time. In order to trace a lengthy, looping line of sacred dates, entire generations of scribes were instructed to extrapolate both forward and backward. However, a lot of early tables just omit some years. Others condense centuries into a few decades. It's not a random chaos. It has a pattern, similar to someone putting a broken vase back together and discovering too late that one of the pieces is part of a whole different set. The strangeness doesn't end there. Although the Anno Domini dating system was frequently used by monks in the early Middle Ages to determine the year of our Lord, it wasn't until centuries after the purported birth of Christ that it became widely used. Furthermore, there were still disputes regarding the precise year of Jesus' birth. Early chroniclers believed it to be 02 BC. It was ranked at 4A by others. Some bold voices even advocated for 07 BC, because order produces authority, and authority defines the timeline. It seems as though no one really knew, or worse, no one really cared until someone decided they needed to put a stop to it. So maybe the year isn't the most important question. However, who gains by choosing the year? Consider a court from the Middle Ages, with priests on either side. A king rests on his throne. They hold out a scroll to him, declaring that it is the 1000th year since Christ's birth. The room trembles. People give a gasp. What a privilege! What a duty! Despite not knowing any more than his subjects what year it is, he nods gravely. However, it is written after that. And if, a century later, someone remarks, "Wait, that seems off," since the official record has already been sung from pulpits, embroidered into banners, and carved onto cathedrals, good luck contesting it. Now you check your own watch. The gentle green fingers shine. You've never once doubted the exact hour and minute that it reads. However, the monks did. The popes did. Not even the sun, which constantly rises, appears to care what people write. In ledgers, in the past, calendars were used as political weapons by empires and religions to gauge adherence as well as time. But you're still bothered by something deeper. It's the subdued notion that time might not simply float. It may cause delays. Perhaps humanity has been gradually figuring out its place in the universe after a protracted slumber, and someone tampered with the numbers somewhere in the mist, inspired by ambition, not malice. Furthermore, it's possible that this is the most human thing of all. Once more, the candlelight flickers. Now, your footsteps reverberate, not through palaces or monasteries, but rather through a vague patchwork of tales, some noble, some dubious, all centered around the name Charlemagne. Yes, exactly. Pope Leo III crowned Charles the Great, the brightest star of early medieval Europe, Emperor of the Romans in 800. As a warrior, a legislator, a patron of the arts, and a second Constantine, Charlemagne is credited with creating a new empire from the ashes of the old. But look closer and lean in. It seems like his story is a bit too ideal. First, let's do something easy: the coronation. It was December 25th, 800, Christmas morning in the snow. Charles is taken aback when Pope Leo places the imperial crown on his head during Mass. What a time! How symbolic! It reads as though it was later intended that way. The curtain begins to shake at this point. According to some accounts, Charlemagne was unaware of the coronation in advance. Others say he planned the whole thing. Others speculate that there might have been 2 coronations, too many variations, too many retellings, once for show, once for recording. Which is accurate? You enter the contradiction chamber more thoroughly. Charlemagne is credited with standardizing laws, fostering education, and bringing much of Western Europe together. Although he was multilingual, he was illiterate. His court academics, including Alouen of York, preserved ancient manuscripts and created the Carolingian minuscule script, which would serve as the foundation for contemporary lowercase writing. He also launched a renaissance in art and culture, known as the Carolian Renaissance. However, something is lacking. For starters, his mausoleum. According to legend, Charlemagne was laid to rest beneath a golden throne in Aachen Cathedral. Centuries later, however, archaeologists discovered very little in his purported tomb, few bones, and a few scattered artifacts. but no imposing sarcophagus or treasures worthy of the guy who was essentially the father of Europe. The most powerful monarch of his time should, of course, leave behind a massive physical legacy. Rather, we have shreds and pieces. And now for the unsettling idea. What if there was no Charlemagne? Not entirely. In any case, some scholars suggest that Charlemagne might have been a combination of a number of previous monarchs, perhaps enhanced or created entirely for political reasons. What may that be used for? To build a bridge, a link between the burgeoning Holy Roman Empire and the former Roman Empire. The void left by Charlemagne's absence is horrifying. The decline of Western Rome and the ascent of Otto the Great span about 3 centuries. The continuity line it breaks too easily. Thus, Charlemagne appears as a narrative glue and a constructed savior. The void is filled by his empire. Roman codes are echoed in his laws. His coronation is modeled after Caesar's victories. The historic majesty of Charles and the sacred grandeur of Christ are embodied in his name. Magnus, great; Charlemagne, Carus, grace, a moniker fit for a legend. The few coins produced during his rule are now scarce, almost suspiciously so. They are exceptionally well written for the period, but historians refer to them as anomalies. His Aachen capital is undoubtedly real. The archaeological layers are scant even there, though when there is less evidence than one might anticipate for the location of a continental empire. His legacy, however, is tremendous. His story is taught to schoolchildren throughout Europe. In his honor, statues rise. In keeping with a story that was already etched in stone, Napoleon even referred to himself as a new Charlemagne. You pause here in the silent hall of questions and touch this legend's smooth wall. Is it painted plaster or actual stone? Because the entire early medieval timeline is called into question if Charlemagne's account is fabricated or exaggerated. It would imply that almost 3 centuries of European history may have been altered after the fact in order to coincide Otward's coronation with a Christian milestone that dates back a millennium, like a neatly curated family tree that conceals a few uncles who were a bit too scandalous. It's a comfortable legend. However, who created Charlemagne's rule, if it is a fake? Popes who fervently desired for the Church to seem ageless and Rome-born may have influenced the Carolingians themselves, the Ottonians, afterward, or scribes. Remember that if the victorious tell the story of history, the surviving scribes tell the story of historical time, and they lived. With quills brimming with silent authority, those monks sat in scriptoria, correcting calendars, redrafting records, and recounting stories. A backdated miracle, a name borrowed there, a rectification here. Charlemagne's shadow soon rises to prominence. You halt your breathing because it's so tall that it conceals the sun. Now you sense it, like velvet drapes, the weight of centuries, some genuine, some sculpted, presses down. It's not necessary to completely repudiate Charlemagne. He might have been real. Perhaps he was just overstating things. In any case, you start to realize that time is more than just a recorded event, much like memory. It's carefully chosen, organized, and positioned halfway between reality and fiction. A monarch with a golden crown could be waiting to be discovered or forgotten. A somber, ink-scented silence descends upon you. Stone walls, narrow windows, the soft scratch of quills on parchment, and rows of monks sitting slumped under flickering light are all features of a medieval scriptorium. where each monk is meticulously transcribing text. However, you notice something strange when you look over their shoulders. The pages are excessively neat. The Latin is too flawless, and these texts shine with brilliance for a time that is said to have been engulfed in chaos the Dark Ages. Isn't that odd? Let's take a brief break. It's been believed that Western Europe descended into barbarism following the fall of Rome, with cities being looted, literacy declining, roads decaying, and baths overrun with rodents. Nevertheless, someone is composing a sophisticated prose piece in this chilly, candlelit room, maintaining information with grace, proper syntax, and margin notes. The total doesn't add up. You're not the first person to notice now, because the manuscripts ascribed to the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries frequently seem strangely modern, not in substance, but in structure. Scholars have been silently discussing this paradox for decades. Compared to the broken, vulgar Latin of the alleged earlier periods, the Latin is more consistent. In certain instances, the handwriting was strikingly similar to that of monks who had been educated to use an undeveloped script. This leads us to the Carolinian minuscule, a neat, intelligible script in lowercase that sprang out of nowhere in the late 8th century. It was created by Charlemagne's scholars as part of his educational reform, according to historians. Once more, however, there is a whisper in the background. Was this script invented during the Renaissance and then retroactively applied to the early Middle Ages to make them seem more literate? You bend over the shoulder of a monk. He is creating a hagiography, a story of miracles and missionary efforts in what is now Switzerland, and the life of Saint Ogal. The pages are glowing. The corners are glistening with gold leaf. However, there is an issue. Place names and other facts that weren't discovered until centuries later are included in fatali. You continue to walk. You've passed another monk now. He is replicating Fredegar's chronicle. Scholars have noted how many later political systems appear to leak backward into the book, as if someone were writing from hindsight while feigning not to. The text is intended to explain the Frankish civilization of the 7th century. The parchment itself comes next. Hand-prepared animal skin is valuable. It is scraped, recycled, and repurposed. Palimpsests, or older writings that were erased to make room for newer ones, are found in many medieval manuscripts. However, many of the records from this dark 3rd century period are pristine, with no layering or reuse, as though they were created from scratch. Why is there so little evidence of editing, rewriting, and human messiances in a world where parchment was costly? Unless, of course, the texts were produced centuries later in large quantities to support a false past rather than in real time at all. The scrolls are being catalogued at a broad wooden table. Saints canonized in the 12th century are listed in the catalogue, which purports to be from the 9th century. The dating isn't compatible. The scribes shrugged. You see, truth and authority were not synonymous during the Middle Ages. It has to do with continuity. Only if a monastery could demonstrate that it was founded in antiquity could it be granted legitimacy, land, or relics. Making ancient records is the best approach to demonstrate this. Scribes were telling the truth. That's right. They were putting things back where they belonged. After all, if the monastery was real, its charter must have been drafted in the 7th century. Given that no such document has survived, it would be wiser to write one right away and preserve the narrative for God's honor. There you have it. It's devotion, not deceit, convenience, or conspiracy. However, these restorations become a reality as time goes on. An original is a copy of a copy. An encyclopedia footnote is a well-told fable. Time squirms about itself. You stop by a window and gaze at the dim dawn outside. Consider attempting to reconstruct the 21st century based solely on emails, receipts, and grainy images. Take 90% of those out now. Add wars, fires, and floods. Try again now. Medieval historians had to deal with that. Who could blame them then when they had to make up a missing charter, end an inconvenient dynasty, or appropriate an emperor's accomplishments from a nearby region? Imagine, however, that since the centuries in issue never ever lived, you had to start anew. It's a terrifying idea. Still, doesn't it seem feasible? You plod ahead. Annals Regni Francorum is a shelf that contains royal declarations, official histories, and the royal Frankish annals. They start under Charlemagne and go on for decades, but they are strangely consistent in tone, vocabulary, and style, as though they were all penned at once. You touch one with your finger. It's easy to lift the dust. No repairs, no layering, no indications of time. Suddenly, despite all the talk of medieval chaos, conflict, and collapse, you have to face reality. The records appear curiously intact. They are simply blank, not disorganized or damaged. It appears as if a large void in the history has been covered with a few credible frescoes, and they gave them a courteous nod and went on when later academics began to appreciate them. You groan as you start to realize the more profound reality. The winners are not the only ones who write that history. It is kept up to date by the silent labors of scribes, whose respect frequently surpassed their rega. Your steps suddenly feel heavier, as if the air itself has become thicker, not with age or dust or incense, but with absence. You have left the manuscripts and the paper and ink behind. The gravel makes your sandals crunch. You are traversing the earth rather than recollections. Because history may be fabricated, people can fabricate, and scribes can create. But the soil never. This is where archaeologists murmur. Nevertheless, the ground is oddly silent throughout the years. 614 to 919. You are kneeling next to a trench in the ground, where a group of contemporary scholars have been removing layers of time for years. Every epoch leaves behind its own waste, including broken combs, broken bones, burnt charcoal, ceramic shards, tool fragments, and evidence that people lived, worked, and slept in archaeological digs across Europe, from France to Germany and Italy to Hungary. However, those strata significantly thin out between the 7th and 10th centuries. Not that there is nothing left. The problem is that it's much less than you may think. Cities don't seem to be growing. Villages don't make much of an impression. Graveyards seem to stop. Next, snap. Around the 10th century, activity abruptly increases once more, as though the ground had been holding its breath while lying motionless. This wasn't referred to as a gap in archaeology for 3 centuries. Researchers are plagued by a phenomenon known as a pause. They make an effort to clarify it. Populations may have decreased, people may have moved, the data may have been distorted by inadequate financing or poor preservation. All sensible concepts. However, it begins to feel less like an accident, and more like a pattern when the same thinness appears in several places in various forms, such as pollen layers, architectural remnants, and artifacts. Let's examine the most fundamental proof: ceramics. Medieval ceramics serve as acronometer, with various forms, glazes, and geographical areas. By examining its shards, you may frequently determine the date of a dig. Curiously, however, the subsequent centuries saw a significant decline in both diversity and frequency. People seem to have ceased eating from brittle bowls or being tallied. Now you turn towards the walls of an old building, maybe a villa or a church, because stone doesn't lie. Archaeologists adore it. However, some churches that were purportedly constructed in the 8th or 9th centuries exhibit design elements and building methods that were first widely used in the 11th century. Were these churches constructed later and out of date, or early and ahead of their time? During this time, even funeral traditions change strangely. In the 6th and 7th centuries, burial goods, jewelry, tools, coinage, and status marks were common, but by the 8th century, these items had disappeared. Simply and anonymously, bodies are interred, frequently in plots that are left unmarked. Some think it's a show of Christian humility, or maybe that people had forgotten who these tombs belonged to. Since they were inserted after the fact, they were forgotten. You pass another excavation site. Under the contemporary roadway, a Roman route vanishes. However, there is nothing Roman to Gatmadorn, like a scene from a movie reel between the layers, where you would anticipate centuries of wear and repair. Beside you, a quiet voice whispers about dendrochronology, tree ring dating, trees, and how they are better at recording time than people. Each ring represents a year. Additionally, extensive sequences connecting ancient timbers to the present have been assembled throughout Central Europe. However, the timeline becomes hazy even here. There are certain segments that don't match, especially those related to early medieval structures. Although the rings are present, they do not line up with our perception of their proper placement. Timber that was purportedly cut between 850 has growth patterns more appropriate for 1100. Scientists dismiss it as faulty data, incorrect identification, or possibly a repurposed beam. However, how many beams need to be reused before you start to suspect that the dates may not be accurate? Not even the supreme arbitrator of historical truth, carbon dating, is flawless. Degradation occurs in organic materials. Contexts are hazy. A leather fragment discovered in a lair from the 9th century could provide a reading from the 12th century, and vice versa. For this, archaeologists make adjustments. However, the calibration process itself is predicated on past presumptions. An odd realization begins to seep in. We have now constructed the world's timeline based on consensus rather than fact. Documents are used to identify layers. Style is used to date documents. Other websites are used to infer style. History helps us understand other sites. And a monk in a tower wrote the history. He was copying a narrative he had heard from a priest who was someone's grandfather. The entire tapestry begins to droop if you take away even one thread, such as the steadfast conviction that the year 800 actually occurred as recorded. Let's avoid spiraling, though. Let's literally put ourselves back on the earth. Although there aren't quite as many as there ought to be, there are actual walls, real coins, and real bones. Institutions also frequently defend the timeline when questioned, rather than looking into its flaws, because the museums would have to rename their exhibits if those phantom centuries had never occurred. New scripts would be required for the tour leaders. It would be necessary to rewrite the textbooks. It would be necessary to repaint each timeline that was painted on a classroom wall. Ignoring the silence is much simpler. Leave the gaps in place. Unquestionably let the centuries hum in the background. Now, however, you stand on the brink of one of these spaces, gazing down into the earth that ought to be teeming with shattered pots, charred beams, and the commonplace remnants of human existence. Rather, you observe silence, and you ask yourself, who was there? Was there anyone? Or is this the stage set of the archaeologist? Believable, logical, yet subtly deceptive. You now enter a place that is warmer not in terms of temperature, but in terms of belief than the chilly ground and deserted tombs. Candle smoke and age-old devotion fill the stone walls that rise around you once more. Holy bones, hushed, prayers, and faith etched into marble and wood can all be found here. Greetings from the realm of relics and the more profound enigma of history based on beliefs. The room you're in is a medieval reliquary. In the shifting light, glass cases glisten. Each contains a fragment of the divine, such as a feather from the Archangel Michael's wing, a thorn from Christ's crown, a vial of the Virgin Mary's milk, or a splinter of the genuine cross. The number of relics is enormous, too many. Additionally, each one has a provenance, history, and date. However, do they? You pass ivory cases and gilded boxes. The craftsmanship shines with styles that were popular hundreds of years later, despite the fact that many claim they date from the phantom centuries, the 8th or 9th century, like going to a Carolian coronation in Renaissance boots. Not because the artifacts are phony, not precisely. Their stories were written after theft, that's why. Let's take the saint's bones. Asterisk, asterisk, the bones of a martyr may support an entire cathedral. By the early Middle Ages, having a saint's tooth or femur denoted authority. Pilgrims would fill the seats, offer money, and travel distances. The cities grew up around the tombs. Churches rose into the air. Imagine the motivation to embellish, then. A piece of bone grows into a saint's whole skull. Conveniently, the found grave of a local bishop is dated to 732. A 7th century miracle has been kept for centuries in a church that was constructed in 1010. You turn to a case containing a frayed piece of cloth, even though there hasn't been any mention of it until recently. Robe of Saint Benedict, worn in the year 672, the placard says. However, a copy of the same relic's description found in the archives nearby states that a nobleman gave it to the church in 1121. Whoops. The medieval church, you know, had a different idea about time. Sacred time was not a straight line. There were layers to it. Saints had eternal lives. Over the centuries, miracles continued to occur. If the tale of a relic inspired faith, what difference did it make if it was found in 720 or 1120? You catch a glimpse of a monk at the altar, lighting a taper. With true respect, he bows to their reliquary. The date is secondary to him. It's the presence that counts. However, dating is very important to you. War on the brink of skepticism. Because what else from that era has been backdated, if relics can be done so to support a cathedral's claim? This is an odd trend. The relics in some churches are identical. One is St. John's skull, another one, and another. One saint, three skulls. Once more, fraud is not the solution. It's faith. However, this allows for the possibility of something unfamiliar. What if there were duplicates of complete histories rather than simply bones? What if a miracle from 724 and one from 1030 seemed disturbingly alike? The plotline, localities, missing centuries, and saints are all distinct. Now think about sacred writings. Numerous saints' lives and hagiographies read like adventure books. Born in 6030, the saint works miracles by 6060 and dies as a martyr in 602-6060. In the dark, his bones shine. Snakes are turned to stone by his staff. When he dies, his hair regrows. Written in 1103, it is the oldest copy of his life that has survived. Once more, this is explained away by the gap writers. Older versions were hidden from iconoclasts and destroyed by Vikings. Reasonable Butenkonsist incidents that were recorded much later are supposed to have taken place in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. What if those tales had never been forgotten? What if they had never existed in the first place? Consider an 11th century monk who was under pressure to exalt the patron saint of Hisabe. There are few records. Therefore, he dates it to 693 and creates a wonderful story that is full of marvels and divine purpose. Who would doubt him? After all, literacy is uncommon. Travel is risky. There are few records. Scripture is his word, and reverence, not dishonesty, silently fills the void in history. You now pass a reliquary that says to grasp St. Luke's finger. It gleams in the glass, but next to it is an inscription that was put here in the year 872, when Charles the Bald was in power. Oh, the fictionally named King Charles the Bald. Questions have also been raised about his reign. Uncertain battles, redundant charters, and sloppy record-keeping. Some others think he might have been a character from the same mold, an echo of previous Carolians. Thus, skepticism resurfaces when an artifact purports to be from his rule. One shadow supports another. The great defender of continuity, the Church itself, suddenly starts to waver in the candlelight. How much of what we refer to as the medieval Church was created after the fact to give contemporary power a medieval spine if the relics are undated? The saints are backwritten and the miracles are replicated. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the complete standardization of even the liturgical calendar, that rhythmic dance of saints' days and holy feasts. Nevertheless, a lot of saints from the 8th and 9th centuries are commemorated with great accuracy. You start to get the impression that someone decided to paint the missing pieces of a puzzle to match the ones that were missing, with a sense of sacred responsibility, not with wickedness or malice, because reality wasn't what happened to those bishops and monks. What ought to have occurred in accordance with God's will was truth. Thus, they used light, religion, and suitable narrative to fill in the empty centuries. You can now stroll around their artworks centuries later. Now, as your eyes adjust to a broader horizon, you emerge from the flickering Grequias, the areas where actual people formerly lived, past the scribal towers and stone chapels. History tends to overlook the rural areas, the hills, the lost valleys of early medieval Europe, and the locations where lives are rarely documented. And what you discover there is emptiness rather than quiet. The disappearing people's enigma lies in this: Hungary and erected ring-shaped strongholds. Records show that they flourished from the 6th century until the beginning of the 9th century, after which they disappeared, not slowly, not whiningly, but simply gone. Their burials, weapons, and jewelry are discovered by archaeology. However, there are not enough coins or pieces to fill a drawer from the alleged 8th century. Where did they go, you ask? They were absorbed by the Franks, according to certain historians. Others give a shrug. You continue northward on foot. You arrive in areas that were formerly occupied by the Slavs, a whole ethnic and linguistic group that migrated throughout Eastern Europe. However, something seems missing here as well. Rather than following centuries of slow development, their settlements jump quickly from crude wooden huts into high medieval town grids. And where are the middens, the irrigation systems, the bridges, and the garbage piles filled with misplaced buttons and shattered dishes? Though not where they should be, they are present. Many completely developed villages that claim to be centuries old but have no evidence of previous habitation beneath them pop up out of nowhere in the 10th or 11th century. It's similar to discovering a tree without any roots. In what used to be a Slavic village, you kneel next to an ancient well. The stones are uniformly clean. The pottery in the area is 950 years old. But you're on Roman soil if you dig a few inches further. No middle layer, not even a broken comb, no traces of life from the ages that have gone lost. The Freons, who are mariners from the North Sea coast, come next. They can be found trading, raiding, and fighting the Franks in the early chronicles. However, they falter just when you think they'll become a regional force. According to one chronicle, Charlemagne subdued them. According to another, they merely became Christians and vanished into the larger Frankish society. In any case, there is, at best, little tangible proof of a thriving cold civilization throughout the phantom centuries. Once more, you ask yourself, are these people truly disappearing, or did they never really exist as we think they would? The more you look, the more patterns you find. For millennia, entire communities that ought to have left behind structures, tombs, marketplaces, harbors, and trade routes leave behind virtually nothing. Then they sprang into view in the 10th and 11th centuries. Cathedrals, town charters, and tax duties. It's as though a switch was flipped. This is where things start to get weird. Estimates of the population during the phantom centuries are strangely low throughout all of Europe. According to some historians, there were only 10 or 15 million people living on the continent, not nearly as many as in the Roman era. Why plague, famine, and invasion, they say. However, the calculations don't add up. Basic reproduction would have progressively restored populations, even in the face of instability. However, we discover deserted villages, unutilized highways, and trees reclaiming agricultural leers as though the land itself had forgotten about people. When compared to the physical evidence, even the well-known migrations, the waves of Goths, Vandals, and Huns, become less distinct. Names are hazy, identity changes. In one century, tribes emerge, vanish, and then reappear under new names. For instance, in the 6th century, The Lombards take control of northern Italy, reign for a while, and then disappear into Carolingian legends. However, they left very little material evidence of the lost centuries. What about Thelamani, the Swabi, and the Burgundians? Some leave behind carved stone and magnificent cemeteries. Some disappear into folklore and rumor, such as the Avars. You start to think that the concept of cohesive tribes or peoples might have been created in the past. Later, in order to preserve the past, chroniclers required order and labels. In order to frame their stories, they created lineages where none existed, gave names to disparate groups, and added dates. However, those stories, like their equerries, may be imaginary and beautiful. The tidy racial distinctions of early medieval Europe have begun to be called into question, even by genetic studies, despite historical accounts of invasion and conquest. DNA shows long-term continuity in many areas, with populations that didn't actually change. Who were the invaders then, if the population remained constant? Were the invasions merely symbolic? Other than population upheaval, how would one characterize political change? Somewhere, you sit by a stream and watch the water flow over smooth stones. A monk records a peasant uprising in this area in a manuscript from 726. However, just the stream, the stones, and the silence have been discovered. No tools, no weapons, and no layer of burnt dirt. You start to feel the hypothesis's weight bearing down on you. What if civilizations survived the early Middle Ages? What if they were never originally recorded? Worse yet, what if they were created later to fill in the void created by someone? Silently woven 3 centuries into a tale that lasted 1,000 years. The Avars, Freons, and early Slavs you are looking for turn into hazy shadows. Their tombs become chilly, their artifacts deteriorate, and their legends flicker. You climb out of the stream and carry on with your journey through the years that have been lost. People no longer ask you where they went. You begin to question whether they were ever truly present. Now, instead of looking down into tombs or manuscripts, you look up into the sky, because stars do not lie, forget, or rewrite, whereas humans do. Their movements are precise and patient. In stone and tale, they leave their mark. And there is a commonality across Greek, Arab, and Chinese cultures. Eclipses are recorded by all skywatchers, because the stars might be the only witnesses brave enough to speak the truth. If there is a falsehood buried in time, you follow them in silence. Commence in the year 700 in ancient China. Astronomers keep careful logs, forecast eclipses, and monitor the moon's motion. Their language is clear, their dates are accurate, and their records go back thousands of years without any gaps or phantom rulers. Now look towards Europe, to the west. Eclipses can occur anywhere. They don't respect boundaries. Therefore, we should be able to match a European record with a Chinese record if the Chinese record indicates a total solar eclipse in the year 719. A monk seeing the sky get darker. In many instances, there is silence, or worse, misalignment, despite a chronicler writing omens in the margins. Today's astronomers can determine the exact location and time of eclipses in the past thanks to computers, algorithms, and models of celestial physics. Furthermore, the medieval dates we have been provided don't always correspond with those occurrences. There is no record of any reference to an eclipse that is supposed to have occurred in 807 across northern France. However, the description puts it at the wrong time of day or over the wrong area. A scribal error, perhaps. This is the belief held by phantom time theorists like Herbert Illig. If 3 centuries were added to a calendar, it would throw off the celestial schedule. Although stars are truthful, they would show that Earth's orbit and rotation deviate from what we have historically expected, and it becomes more difficult. Julius Caesar established the Julian calendar in 45 BC. However, it deviates from the solar year by roughly 11 minutes every year. By 1582, Pope Gregory observed that, unlike at the Council of Nika in 325, the spring equinox was no longer falling on March 21st, so he corrected it. In October of 1582, 10 days were skipped. A Friday was scheduled 11 days after a Thursday. Here's the twist, though. If, after 1,600 years of drift, only 10 days had to be eliminated, the calculations are incorrect. More, perhaps 13 days, should have been the expected drift. 3 days is too short. About 300 years have gone missing. Some claim that Pope Gregory ignored Caesar's initial mistake and instead based his reform on the more recent year, 325, rather than on calculations from antiquity. The phantom time concept, however, interprets it in a different way. Since those years never occurred, there were fewer years to fix. Now you enter a planetarium. It's a round stone chamber tucked away in a medieval castle, not one made of glass and technology. Sunlight traces patterns on carved zodiac signs through holes in the ceiling. It's a light calendar. This is when the disparity increases. Why did medieval builders' liturgy calendars veer so far from the path of the sun if they were familiar enough with the sky to line cathedrals with solstices? What caused Easter, the foundation of Christian rhythm, to start to fade from its springtime position? Why did academics argue over the best time to celebrate feasts? The stars weren't incorrect if the sky was directly overhead. Perhaps the dates were, though. The moon is significant to Islamic tradition. Holidays and prayers are guided by carefully maintained lunar calendars. Muslim astronomers such as al-Biruni and al-Zarali published extensive treatises on timekeeping, made astrolabes, and determined the locations of the planets. During the 11th and 12th centuries, oddly immediately following the alleged missing centuries, their creations were assimilated into Europe, and a large number of their models do not quite fit the earlier Christian chronology. Could it be that even in Jewish towns where lunar calendars also prevailed, the Islamic records, free from papal chronology, contained a purer, or at least less distorted, thread of time? An unusual drift in the festival date was observed by scholars. There were heated arguments on whether to use sacred authority, tradition, or mathematics to correct them. The calendar and the sky were clearly out of sync, and each time an attempt was made to correct it, the ghost of time that didn't belong was exposed. Now you look up at the sky, consider a complete eclipse. The birds stop talking, darkness deepens. For a little instant, the world becomes chilly. It is a strong memory. It's not the kind you forget, not the kind that you forget to record. Therefore, it is a warning sign when there is a lengthy period of centuries in which there are no eclipses. Reports in Europe, someone would have seen them, unless the centuries were written in retrospect rather than lived at all. an emperor declaring his dominion divinely scheduled, a pope choosing a feast day, or a monk creating a timeline. All of them believed they were constructing truth, yet the stars remained motionless. You don't now, either. Under 1,000 points of light, you remain still. Each one is older than any crown, kingdom, or chronicle. You sense it, too. That silence in between seconds, that nagging doubt. What if all of our stories have been rearranged, not made up, but told in the wrong order? As you walk, the stars continue to shine above you. Now, however, your route veers south across the Mediterranean into places where scholars and caliphs ink and stillness, rather than monks and popes, kept time. You are entering the Islamic Golden Period, when the night sky was explored for truth, rather than mysticism. And that's when you start to detect something odd in the great learning cities of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba. It is said that ignorance and war caused the lamps of medieval Europe to wane, leaving it to float in darkness. The Islamic world was alert, alive, and accurate, and something appears to be missing from those exact records. Or rather, you don't have the same amount of time as someone else. Let's begin with the House of Knowledge in Baghdad. During the Abbasid Caliphate in the early 800s, Might al-Hikmah was established. Here, academics disputed the Earth's shape, translated Greek literature, and made incredibly accurate calculations of the globe's diameter. They named the stars we still use today, mapped the cosmos, and created mathematics. They left observatories, libraries, and books behind. In fact, we have so many volumes that we can put together decades worth of their work. Who instructed whom? What was challenged by whom? Who passed away? What disease? And when? However, the timeline trembles when you attempt to align their records with European history from the same time period, say 700 to 900 AD, because there is no reflection. The Arab chroniclers hardly mention Europe's claimed reconstruction following the fall of Rome, with kings ascending, churches growing, and monks copying. Shouldn't they have realized that throughout those 297 phantom years, they had communication with the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and Byzantium, but they speak virtually nothing about the Christian West? In actuality, there is little any discussion of the growing Frankish authority, despite the fact that several Islamic scholars mention contacts with Byzantium, the Persians, and internal dynasties. No, yes, exactly. We received a letter from Charlemagne. No, the Saxon Wars were reported to us. No mention of popes gaining unexpected political power in Rome. No trad records, and no diplomatic envoys. Europe then abruptly returns in the 10th century, almost out of thin air. More precise maps of Europe are being described by Muslim geographers. Further north, traders go. The Christian kingdoms are more frequently recognized by academics. Islamic consciousness is once more influenced by the West, but a hole for those years that were lost. The Carolingian Empire and Charlemagne, who is thought to have been one of the most powerful Christian kings in history, are not mentioned in the extensive chronicle of wars and earthquakes that one scholar from the late 9th century writes. Strange, isn't it? Particularly considering how meticulously the Muslim world maintained documentation. Additionally, they frequently described Europe as a backwater, a place with primitive tribal peoples, pagan holdouts, and tiny bishoprics. The magnificent kings and glittering courts that European monks were writing about at the same time were nowhere to be seen. Is it possible that the monks were creating legends that were unheard of by their Muslim peers, writing in retrospect? You locate a peaceful area close to the Tigris River and take a seat next to a replica of Al-Khwarizm's Zij al-Sind, a 9th century early astrological table. It is cross-referenced, mathematical, and thorough. It covers everything, including solstice measurements, eclipse forecasts, and planetary positions. Internal consistency exists in every piece. However, the dates start to fall apart when these tables are used to support claims from medieval Europe. Even though the math should line up, it doesn't. Al-Tabari, the renowned Persian historian, either contradicts Al-Khwarizm's findings or our timeline is incorrect. He was born in 839 and died in 9-3. He covers the prophets and kings from Adam to the Abbasid Caliphate in his extensive chronicle. Events from the Middle East, North Africa, and even Eastern Europe are covered. But again, absolutely no mention of Western Europe's purported important figures throughout the Phantom Ages. No Charlemagne, no Alfred, no Otto, no Pope Sylvester. Such influential people should have caused a stir instead. The effects appear considerably later, not before, but about the time that Western chroniclers begin to mention Islamic academics and translations. It seems as though someone suddenly synchronized to clocks that had been ticking independently. But someone has to bend one to do it, and whose argument was stronger? The one with the trade records, the math, the stars, or the paper that looked suspiciously clean and had hagiographies on it? You are aware of the solution. Coins even conveyed the story. Islamic dirhams and dinars are reliable. Year after year, ruler after ruler, minted, weighed, and labeled precisely. But when compared to early European currency, the details get hazy. The dating becomes hazy. The weights change, and the inscriptions become fanciful. Early European coins aren't always counterfeit. They're anachronist. That's why. As the river passes, you close the book and come to a profundrealization. It's possible that the Islamic world was the real medieval timekeeper. Islam also maintained calendars, whilst Europe created stories. So you think about another question when the phantom time hypothesis asks, where did those centuries go? What if they didn't make it to the East? Because, in reality, they never passed. The call of prayer fades behind you as you go east toward a realm of glittering mosaics, solemn emperors, and unending bureaucracy. You have reached the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium. It was the most paperwork obsessedization in existence. Everything was recorded, including edicts, court documents, tax returns, naval logs, and diplomatic correspondence. They even catalogued their ink formulations. So certainly, if centuries of Western European history were manufactured, the careful record-keepers of Byzantium would have noticed, right? Nevertheless, you are once more traversing an unfamiliar murk, because the timeline becomes hazy even in this stronghold of consistency. Enter the age of Heraclius I. From 610 to 641, he was emperor. He is a true man. There is ample documentation of his conflicts with the Persians. He fought a deadly fight against the early Muslim troops. Rome came to an end, and a new era began with his reforms, particularly the switch from Latin to Greek in administration. However, a sort of hush descends following Heraclius. The records are sparse for over a century. The biographies of the emperors become ambiguous. Their portraits disappear from currency. The specifics of court life are reduced, and this in a state that formerly kept track of each general's exact tunic. This is attributed by some historians to the turmoil of war. The 7th and 8th centuries were challenging. Slavic migrations, Arab assaults, and plagues. It is understandable that record-keeping could suffer. Here's the strange bit, though. The institutions are still in place. The bureaucracy of Byzantium never fell. The imperial court did not disappear. Constantinople, the capital, was never taken. What causes the gap then? Where are the ceremonial manuals from 745, the naval logs from 710, and the court records from 670? Legends, saints, lives, and a few pieces have taken their place. Then, almost startlingly, records from the 9th century roar. Legal codes are written by Emperor Leo the Wise. Basil I constructs palaces. Trade agreements reappear. And the coinage was crisp, meticulous, and well organized. As though Byzantium had fallen asleep and then woke up 150 years later, stretching and yawning and going about its business as if nothing had occurred. Furthermore, this viewpoint is not exclusive to the West. The haze was seen by Byzantine historians themselves. Take the chronicler Theophanes, the confessor, who passed away in 818. Although his history is said to span from 284 to 813 without interruption, academics have discovered strange omissions, recurring themes, and dubious phrasing similarities. It's as if bits of his source material were a copy-pasted or assembled afterward to create the illusion of uninterrupted continuity. The offense date system, which is based on the calendar of the Byzantine era, is even more peculiar. There are years that don't line up. Strangely exact dates are added to events from faraway places. How did he know the year a Western monarch passed away when there had been no embassy in Constantinople for decades, even without direct contact, unless someone else added those dates afterward? Now you ascend the Hagia Sophia's marble steps, constructed in the 6th century and unaltered by time. Its dome towers over you. However, some of the mosaics within appear oddly new. The stylistic elements of saints' icons that are supposedly from the 8th century were not observed until much later. Little tangible proof of the iconoclastic controversy, which allegedly raged in the 700s and resulted in the banning of religious icons, has survived. Stories told centuries later, without ruined icons, charred frescoes, or fury carved into stone. You travel through the imperial palace complex, now a ghost of its former existence. The hallways used to be lined with scrolls. Reports were traditionally transferred from one gilded hall to another by bureaucrats. However, as compared to earlier and later periods, the amount of surviving records from the 7th to 9th centuries is remarkably small. Absence isn't it? It's a musical pause that resembles a beat being skipped. According to some contemporary academics, Byzantium modified its own chronology to conform to Western Christian counting, arranging the dates to coincide with the mythological founding of Rome or the birth of Christ. However, what if they absorbed invented years in the process? What if the histories of the East and West were synchronized? The phantom was passed down to Byzantium. You go to the Chronographia of 11th century Byzantine scholar Michael Tselos, although his dates are often frequently erratic. He honors previous emperors in such vivid detail that it seems as though he knew them. In Byzantium, as in Rome, he rewrites events to suit rhetorical or theological purposes. Accuracy was subordinated to narrative. You stop under a column that portrays the life of Constantine V, an emperor who is believed to have ruled during the iconoclast era in the 8th century. His legacy is too convenient. His triumphs are always heavenly, and his foes are always heretical. But his biography reads like myth. You start to question whether Constantine V actually existed, or if he was merely a prop to fill the void. Even the urban evolution of the city has a story to tell. The early centuries, as well as the 10th and 11th centuries, are represented in the layers of Constantinople's growth. However, it seemed as though time stopped its breath even here, since there were fewer building projects, renovations, and inscriptions. And Byzantium hardly noticed when the West declared that Charlemagne's crowning was a rebirth. No imperial concern, no grand reaction, and no letters to Rome contesting the title of Roman emperor are there. Why only a later notion was retrofitted into the timeline and silently acknowledged to keep the story tidy, possibly because there was no Charlemagne to notice. You stare out from the royal terrace across the Bosporus. Record diminished, but order never broke in the east. Order broke down in the west, but the record improved. Then there are the phantom years, hanging between the two like a bridge of shadows. The idea that even the most careful empire might have had ghosts in its scrolls haunts you as you depart Byzantium. From the marble corridors of Byzantium, you now descend into the verdant forests of early medieval Europe. The roads get narrower, and the monasteries get smaller. However, something strange meets you as you traverse these areas, which are supposedly only emerging from centuries of collapse. A flash of light, not merely lamps in the dark, but a blaze of activity that seemed to come out of nowhere, including schools, manuscripts, reforms, art, and poetry. Conveniently occurring in the midst of the phantom time gap, it is Referedo as the Carolingian Renaissance. You hesitate. A rebirth from the ruins. Let's examine the information provided. After securing his dominion, Charlemagne begins to revive culture and education. He brings together academics from all throughout Europe. Theodulf Oferlines, Paul the Deacon, and Dalquin of York. They produce new grammar books, glossaries, and standardized Latin. Suddenly, copies of old books appear everywhere, inscribed in the graceful Carolian minuscule, that neat script that we still use for lowercase letters today. Miraculous, impressive, yet dubious convenience. Because a century ago, Europe was said to be hardly literate, with roads in ruins and trade dead. Not even monarchs were able to write their own names. Then, with far less funding and under much greater disorder, imperial courts are creating texts that are on par with Roman style in only one generation. It's like seeing a barn burn to the ground, and then discovering a piano concerto being composed in the ashes. Now you enter a recreated Carolinian classroom, where monks are replicating Cicero and Virgil. Standard punctuation, cautious margins, and glosses are all being used. It seems, dare I say it, overly contemporary. Is it possible that these books were created in the future and then retrospectively added to the chronology, rather than being preserved from the past? The style is the most important piece of evidence. Although many of the literary elements and concepts of the Carolingian Renaissance are more reminiscent of the 11th and 12th centuries than of anything from antiquity, the period is thought to have been a revival of classical civilization. The syntax is more sophisticated, the logic is tighter, and the Latin is cleaner. It's not a new beginning, it's a refit. Now consider this situation. In the 11th century, a monk finds himself in a kingdom that has just become Christian. Legitimacy is what his clients desire. Where is our heritage? Where is our past? They question, and the monk starts writing. He creates an aristocratic family, tells the story of a legendary king named Charlemagne, adds a few conflicts and reforms, writes in an older script, includes some classical allusions, and asserts that all of this took place 300 years ago. Instant renaissance there. Furthermore, nobody challenges him, because there aren't many surviving 6th or 7th century writings that contradict him. In actuality, subsequent scribes merely replicate his writing repeatedly until it is verified by repetition. The few texts from previous centuries that we do have are scarce, incomplete, and sometimes out of date, while Carolingian manuscripts cause libraries to suddenly flood. Before, where were these scribes? Were the writings written later, or were they hiding behind rocks? This hypothesis isn't as radical as it first appears to be in a single, protracted, coordinated wave of rewriting. Think about the Library of the Vatican. The earliest complete Latin manuscripts are from the 9th century, just at the start of the alleged Renaissance. Nearly none of the 7th or 6th. Not that they were lost. In previous inventories, many were never mentioned. They just show up, ... the texts they contain, which were never seen previously but are frequently credited to ancient authors. Maybe they're forgeries, or maybe they're just well-meaning inventions. Moving on to the cathedral schools, Charlemagne's reforms are credited with their success. Rarely, however, are the stone structures they occupied older than the 10th or 11th centuries. The course material was remarkably in line with later scholasticism. It's similar to creating the curriculum before the classroom is even there. What about the artwork? Beautiful Carolian illuminations. Their methods are more akin to Etonian and Romanesque styles, despite the gold leaf, intricate borders, and classical themes. Our familiar styles emerged later. It appears as though a painting was backdated because it was attractive in the gallery. You have finally reached Charlemagne's imperial church, the Palatine Chapel in Aachen. Although its building style, dome, and mosaics more closely resemble Byzantine churches from the 10th century, it is said to have been constructed around 800 AD. It is described as influence by historians. Could it, however, be a reverse chronology? You start to suspect a more serious issue. There is no connection between the Carolingian Renaissance and earlier periods. The move from late Roman literacy to this Renaissance is not seamless. It's a cultural reboot, a timeline hop, and a gap jump. Consider a computer that crashes, then restarts to see all of your files restored. Although with updated software and a new font, why don't historians ask the same question that you would? Where did this come from? Because the story is saved by the Carolingian Renaissance. It describes how Rome gave way to the Middle Ages in Europe. There is a hole without it. However, what if the record does not contain the whole? What if it's actually in time? You enter a library where books are arranged in orderly stacks, manuscripts with dates ranging from 750 to 850. They shine with tenderness. They all seem to have been written in the same decade, with different birthdays, but none of them exhibit any indication of aging growth. It's a subtle fabrication, maybe a necessary one, but nevertheless a fiction. You enter a harsher world, the smoky, long buildings and storm-lashed ships of the north. After leaving the libraries, where golden texts glitter in candlelight, the Vikings are in charge here. Or do they wail with conflicts in their sagas, strange countries, sea creatures, and gods? Names whirl in stories. The boneless Harold Fairhair is Ragnar Lodbrok's son, Ivar. Raids, treaties, and dynasties are all linked to dates. But something takes you by surprise as you enter this history-soaked drama. There are numerous battles. The evidence is shaky, but the dates are accurate. First, let's talk about Lindisfarne, the 8th of June, 793. Vikings raid a monastery on the northeastern coast of England. The Viking Age is said to have begun at this time, a lyrical, brutal, ideal moment. But pause for a moment. How can we determine the precise date? Because, years after the incident, one monk said as much. There isn't the charred destruction you would anticipate from such a legendary onslaught, and the archaeological layer is limited, with some strewn debris and a few burnt logs. Just a narrative, a memory penned after the fact by people who would have had good incentive to exaggerate the horror without mass graves or conclusive Viking artifacts. The Viking raids are still going on. We hear it in France, Ireland, and England. Entire towns collapse. Fire burns in the rivers. They empty monasteries. However, over the same time period, numerous monks produce immaculate texts, unbroken scripturiums, and uninterrupted copying. How can theology be produced in a place that is under siege? The raids might have been short, or maybe the documents were compiled several years after the events they detail occurred. You are now sailing north into Scandinavia, which includes Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. You anticipate that the Viking homeland would be replete with artifacts, weapons, houses, and tools from the 8th and 9th centuries. Some are found, but far less than anticipated. Yes, there are runestones and stone ship burials. However, when objectively dated, many rune inscriptions date to the 10th and 11th centuries. After the Viking attacks, they are said to depict oddly. The earlier ones were not there. Murky dates surround even powerful monarchs like Harald Bluetooth, who converted Denmark to Christianity in the 10th century. According to some historians, Harald never even held power over the lands mentioned in the sagas. The gelling stones, sometimes referred to as Denmark's birth certificate, cause you to halt, almost like a beginning rather than a continuation. They are magnificent, striking, and neatly dated to the century after the Phantom period. Next is Ragnar Lothbrok, the protagonist of innumerable legends. He is the epitome of a legendary France, marrying a shield maiden and plunging himself into snake pits, but he may not actually be one. It's more likely that Ragnar is a composite, built from the stories of other warlords and dating back to the 9th century. Once more, that is the pattern. Later characters echoed backward in time, while earlier events were retrofitted with later names. The historical record even has an odd echo of the huge heathen army that is said to have invaded England in 865, though sporadically. it is mentioned in Anglo-Saxon writings. In terms of style, coins struck under this occupation resemble those struck a full generation later in the 10th century. Do you see anything else? Although Viking invasions typically occur in waves, they nearly always result in treaties or Christian conversions that are ideal for the interests of the Pope. The chronology is well organized, too tidy: struggle, triumph, transformation, and the beat of salvation. However, there is Snetmak burial evidence, like the weapon-rich warrior tombs found in 9th century England. The ones you do locate are frequently questioned and redated. Once heralded as evidence of the great pagan army, a burial at Repton, Derbyshire, was later discovered to contain remains from several centuries ago, presumably mixed up in a subsequent disturbance. Rarely are Viking ships those famous longboats found in distinct layers from the 8th or 9th centuries. Many are younger. Additionally, carbon dating produces a wide range of dates when they do occur in older soil. Inaccurate, but not worthless. Sufficient flexibility to allow timelines to be modified to suit the story. Aren't you beginning to see the script? An orderly timeline that spans the appropriate amount of time, with a world darkened by anarchy, abruptly illuminated by raids, and finally redeemed by conversion. You recall those sagas from some 3 centuries ago. After all, they were conveyed verbally, long after the events they purported to recount occurred. No written versions were produced until the 12th and 13th centuries. The world had altered. By then, the Church was victorious. Kings had the right to reign. Did the sagas serve as history or justification when they were eventually written, a means of describing how untamed Scandinavia had been and how it had now become tamed and Christian? By a fjord you sit, the water is covered in curling mist. A blackbird. You see a monk in Iceland writing ink on vellum, documenting the actions of strangers in places he has never seen over the course of years that may never have happened. He has no malicious intent. He is preserving a story, but it might be more. Of a bridge constructed to span a period of time no one is willing to acknowledge exists than a record. The battles, treaties, and sagas might be echoes rather than actual events. And while the Viking Age may not have been a time we experienced, it was a tale we required. Monks, raiders, and emperors have all passed over. You have questioned calendars, broken currencies, and read sagas. However, you suddenly find yourself in the most peaceful area in history, a graveyard, where people repose. The story should settle here in the soil. The deceased don't tell lies. Or do they? Between the stones, you move slowly. Some are weathered, while others have never been carved. This isn't a graveyard for tourists. Archaeologists travel here to discover the actual rhythm of time. The age of human bones is not forgotten. There are isotopes in teeth. Age, illness, and labor are whispered by skeletons. Something doesn't match up, though, as you squat next to one exposed trench. This woman was buried, wearing a brooch and comb. Her 8th century burial exhibits evidence of dental treatment that was not discovered until the 11th century. You scowl. Perhaps a mislabeling. Then another grave close by. A man with healed fractures and calluses from his sword. Viking is written on his burial things. Farmer, his skeleton says, and samples from the 12th century more closely matched his DNA than those from the 800s. Evidence, or an anomaly. The question that makes the bone box tremble is this one, because there is a strange quiet in graves. All over Europe, particularly in areas that were apparently teeming with life in the 7th and 9th centuries, burial rates decline. Cemetery expansions are on hold. For generations, entire fields remain unspoiled until the 10th century, when they abruptly begin to fill up once more. The dead were where? Did people just cease burying or dying, or were fewer individuals alive altogether? Archaeologists receive cautionary training. They discuss plow damage, erosion, preservation bias, and yes, some tombs disappear. However, the justifications become flimsy when trends emerge across nations, languages, and cultures, consistently within the same period of missing years. Take Grubenhauer, a type of early medieval village house with a sunken floor. Clusters of these basic homes can be found at excavation sites in the Low Countries, Poland and Germany, up until the 7th century. After that, they vanish without being modified or advanced, and they don't resurface until the 10th century in radically altered forms. It's a cut rather than a steady adjustment. In order to fill the void, we turn to the cemeteries, but we are betrayed by the graves. Consider the Latin culture in modern-day Switzerland, which is said to have flourished until the early medieval era. But where you would anticipate burials from the 8th or 9th century, even remote farmers who ought to have been buried under Christian privileges by then are nowhere to be found. And then, bang, in the 11th century, cemetery flowers. Beside them, chapels rise, stone-etched dates come back. After a lengthy delay, it seems as though someone has resumed time. The bones should be rooted in history, according to radiocarbon dating. However, things are hazy here as well. Radiocarbon dates need to be calibrated, you see. Additionally, samples from trees, ice cores, volcanic strata, and other time markers are used to construct those calibration curves. However, the statistics don't add up when applied to specific graves that have been dated by historical context. Carbon dates from certain tombs from the 8th century point to the 11th. The relics of several early saints are centuries too young, which is incorrect. Then the context, or the carbon. The majority of researchers silently accept the possibility of inaccuracy. You now understand, however, that the phantom resides in that boundary as symbols of love and faith. Let's discuss burial goods, jewelry, equipment, and even food gifts. By associating styles with particular decades, archaeologists utilize them to date burials. However, styles don't change much during the phantom centuries. They can remain remarkably constant for up to 200 years, as though no new style had appeared. Or, more likely, no one was around to wear it. By the 7th century, pagan burial practices in Anglo-Saxon England had diminished. Christian burials ought to come next. However, the archaeological imprint decreases for over 2 centuries. Churchyards are still small. Numerous regions have no growth. Then growth takes off after 900. Numerous cemeteries that overlap, a rush of life and death. Someone seems to have flipped the page. You stop at one peculiar grave, a skeleton interred, with implements that are much too archaic for the century in question. Instead of using an iron, use a flint scraper. When earlier objects are believed to have been reused, scholars refer to this as residue. However, How frequently do people enter their deceased with instruments that are hundreds of years old? It's easier to claim the tools are leftovers than to acknowledge that the century itself might be incorrect. Unless those tools were modern rather than antiquated, and the burial was misdated. Strangely, plague pits, which were so well documented during subsequent epidemics, are not present during this period. Why do so few mass graves still exist if the 7th and 9th centuries were characterized by illness, starvation, and conflict? The response is eerie. Perhaps the deceased were not interred in mass graves during those phantom years. Perhaps they were never buried because they might not have a deed since they were dead. The names are long gone, and you are now standing in the shadow of a stone cross. Through the grass, you hear the breeze. You see an archaeologist in the future, sifting through your neighborhood. What would they discover? Your phone, your coffee cup, and your bones. What if your burial was marked 3 centuries too early or too late because they miscalculated your time? Would the haze of mistakes swallow up your life? You enter a different kind of cemetery now. Or might someone one day stand where you rest and ask, were you ever here at all? Not of individuals, but of structures and places of worship rising across Europe from crags and meadows. Rain and wind have worn some of them. Others were as immaculate as newly constructed, and the same secret is whispered by them all. The crosses are identical. In rural France, you go to a chapel, somber and stone gray. It stands by itself. According to the local guide, it was constructed in 739. You give a nod. The stones appear to be ancient. Then you go to a comparable chapel in Germany that was built in 910 and another in Spain that was built in 1050. The design is identical. The floor plan is the same, and the stones are the same. Each one has a spooky silence that is similar to entering a copy machine that is set on sacred architecture. The same Cyzias, the nave, the same archaic carvings of saints with wide faces and peculiarly almond eyes, as well as the same column forms. Architecture and art shouldn't change like this. They react to fashion, tools, and materials. However, many churches seem to have stagnated between the alleged 8th and 11th centuries. Why? Why is the sacred architecture so consistent after 300 years? In Burgundy, you touch the corner of a church wall. It was built similarly to another Bavarian church, utilizing thick lime mortar and rocky rubble. One was purportedly constructed 150 years later. Rustic style and local tradition are dismissed by certain art historians. However, you've seen enough to recognize when a pattern is overly ideal. And in each community, there are crosses in addition to the walls. Nearly identical patterns, such as entwined vines, rudimentary crucifixions, and circles behind Christ's head, are shown on the stone crosses outside chapels. They were dated to 750, 950, and 1050, respectively, but in depth of carving, wear, and craftsmanship, despite not being descended, they are brothers and triplets. This homogeneity is frequently attributed to isolation. Change is distant in rural villages. However, the church was not alone. Ideas flowed, craftsmen moved, and bishops traveled. Pilgrimage routes linked France to Spain and Italy to Britain. As early as the Middle Ages, where is the Romanesque, Gothic, and Baroque progression then? Over time, the styles change churches. However, we obtain a flat line between the fall of Rome and the emergence of Romanesque. Picture the face of a youngster growing from infancy to adolescence as you open a photo album. Then, without any change in between, leap into maturity. Just a pause, without braces, a bad hairstyle, or hazy recollections. Early medieval architecture has that vibe to it. Think about crypts, which were underground rooms beneath churches used to store treasures. Saints were revered. When examined, several of them are dated to the 8th or 9th centuries, despite their engineering methods that are compatible vaults, barrel arches, corbelled stones, and even tool marks from the 11th century reveal the same chisels used by later builders. Roman columns are reused in certain churches. According to historians, this demonstrates the continuation of builders' use of repurposed materials. However, the placement is frequently too ideal and symbolic, giving the impression that the builders were building continuity rather than recycling. Because a church with Roman columns seems old, holy, and authentic. This is echoed by the floor tiles as well. Carolingian chapels have geometric mosaics that remarkably resemble those found in high medieval cathedrals. The glazes and clay are the same. Decomposition is not what this is. This is deliberate imitation. What does that signify, then? According to one theory, whole groups of churches were given birth years, centuries before they were really constructed in order to date them retroactively. According to monks, churches had an incentive to age quickly in order to establish their geographic antiquity, claim apostolic roots, and compete with competing denominations in a society where being older was seen as a sign of holiness. Even though our chapel was 10 years old, it was constructed in 712 by a traveling saint. It becomes a custom. In stone, the date is engraved. Who would contest it? But they are familiar with the stones themselves. Masonry is a time teller. Despite being built in the 12th century, stave churches in Norway have runic inscriptions that seem older. The Woods radiocarbon testing supports the latter date rather than the older one. Despite assertions of 750 or 800, pre-Romanesque chapels in other locations are carbon dated to 900 or later. The dates are not in sync. Around 1000, the Romanesque style is thought to have begun to take shape. Massive naves, round arches, and thick walls. However, certain aspects of this style that are already evident in Carolingian churches imply that the style was out of date rather than evolving. The Carolingian style was not superseded by the Romanesque. Either Romanesque evolved first, or they were contemporaries. You can now see the genuine possibility that what we refer to as early medieval architecture may actually be a made-up backstory, a visual myth, beautiful and convincing, but put together later with saintly dedications, ancient dates, and matching cross designs to cover up a break-in period that no one wanted to acknowledge. You pass under a stone arch that was allegedly constructed in 829. Your hand brushes the groove worn by countless fingers, but the tools that molded it are identicalto, those employed in the 11th century. Your shoulder is touched by a ghost of a mason, not a monk, using stone to bend time. He didn't intend to lie. He simply carried out the strategy, the blueprint that was passed down, the inscription of the date above the door. He built what was ordered of him, and history followed suit. You turn to face the chapel. Although it is serene and quiet, the quiet around it is not meaningless. The sound of years that may never have come is a hum. Now, as you sit on the edge of a field, you see how the wind causes the tall grass to ripple. Somewhere beyond the horizon, bells chime from a remote village, marking an hour, a prayer, a habit transmitted down through time. But you no longer believe the bells. You have lost faith in time. You try to visualize 297 years passing while you close your eyes. How does that feel? Languages change. Woods are cut down. Towns are constructed in real time. 10 generations are born and buried, and centuries make their mark. Nevertheless, there is a peculiar feeling that you have been subtly circling all along when you look at the early Middle Ages. Those centuries that are said to have lasted from 614 to 911. You have the impression that you are dreaming about a perhaps non-existent past. Let's investigate this emotion. Perhaps the idea of mud-covered peasants and shrieking invaders comes to mind when you hear about the Dark Ages. But ignorance and violence are not the true darkness. The deeper shadow, the absence of texture, is the cause. Actual history is jumbled, overlapping, and lopsided. However, the phantom centuries pass by far too easily. No big changes in population, no big linguistic leaps, no big inventions, and no catastrophes that leave a profound, indisputable archaeological mark. A single, invisible hand wrote page after page of chronicle, poem, and charter, all wrapped in consistent legend and given in uniform script. You start to see the dust of unwritten days. Awkward tools, odd tongues, and uneven bridges should be commonplace between the centuries between Roman power and the height of the medieval era. Rather, they seem to be placeholders, smooth transitions, and anticipated results. The intermediates are where you find very few unsuccessful innovations, odd architectural ventures, and linguistic dead ends. Rather, Latin in the early medieval period exhibits exceptional stability. With minimal development in between, legal rules go from Roman precedent to feudal intricacy. Without revealing the scaffolding, buildings leap from ruins to designed Romanesque architecture. The unpredictability of lived time is not this. This is the narrative's neat curve. You pass an orchard on your way. An apple drops. In the distance, a sheep bleats. How many days like this did it take to get from 614 to 911? Thousands upon thousands. However, there aren't many names, messages, or mementos to commemorate their passing. Compare it with just 1 century later. Paper trails, bills, signatures, church records, farming logs, and even graffiti engraved into cloister walls by bored novices, names scratched into pews, and recipes scrawled into margins, are all remnants of the 12th century. However, in the phantom centuries, a monk could live his whole life without making any impression. Or, it's possible that his mark was written for him many years after he passed away. Imagine a weary monk being requested to reproduce a discovered document in a dimly lit antiquescritorium. The ink is new, yet the text says it was written in 734. He duplicates it without inquiry, though, or maybe, according to his supervisor, he writes the original, which must be from 734. It must come from 734. And so it comes to be. It creates the illusion. It's not a fake, it's accomplishment. This century is essential to history. It is necessary for the founding of the monastery. It is essential to the king's lineage. It is essential to the authenticity of the relic. Time turns into a narrative, and after it is told sufficiently, it becomes the sole narrative. But what if the story could be taken out, under maybe nothing? What would you find? Maybe you uncover bare ground beneath the altar from the 8th century, because the altar was positioned later and the date was engraved onto it, because someone required a date to believe in. There was no older chapel or foundation, just soil. Even celestial occurrences seem reassigned. Eclipses associated with pharaohs and emperors are frequently computed in retrospect, as though they were entering events into a spreadsheet rather than reflecting on them in wonder. Real individuals don't see time like this. Time drifts in real time. The edges are frayed. It results in confusion and overlap. Phantom time, however, moves like glass. No fingerprints, no smudges. You see a tapestry marked 8th century when you enter a museum. The stitching is too consistent, and the color is too fresh. Or maybe you simply think it's not right. You understand the sensation of actual history, which is why it's so difficult to measure. It's cluttered, noisy, and contradictory. Here, however, the centuries go by like a dream that you can barely recall. You now live in a world where everything is predicated on the idea that someone somewhere got the dates correct, including your calendar, clocks, and anniversaries. However, what if such presumptions were based on omissions? What if time was added instead of just lost? Consider that. Unlived, unrecorded, and unwitnessed for nearly 3 centuries. Despite this, they are still silently ticking away in your blood, birth date, records, and timelines today, all connected to numbers that might never have existed. What if, instead of 2025, you were born in 1728? What if the Enlightenment took place 100 years ago instead of 300? Imagine that you have been living above a house with a secret room built inside that has been walled off and allowed to settle. In the foundation, up until now, you have never known what lies beneath it. You are in a tiny, disorganized study. A high, narrow windows, soft light causes dust motes to swirl. Books grew on shelves. The fragrance of old paper is one of inquiry and ink. This is not the scriptorium of a monk. It is a modern historian's office. And because someone did ask you, see questioners for the first time in your voyage, rather than scribes, rulers, or constructors. Someone had the audacity to question. The name Hirit Illig appears as you turn the page. He isn't well known and isn't included in textbooks yet. He asked a question in a whisper that broke the consensus. What if, instead of 2025, we are in the year 1728? When he first proposed his phantom time idea in the 1990s, it was first mocked. How may the calendar itself be contested? Time is precious. The time has been decided. Illig, however, wasn't motivated by mayhem. His motivation was inconsistency. He observed the gaps, the absence of archaeological advancement, the questionable consistency of manuscripts, the Byzantine, Arab, and Chinese records links, and the calendar's drift. One by one, he followed the threads you've been walking until he came to the same unsettling conclusion. It's possible that 297 years were made up. He wasn't by himself, either. Anatoly Furko pushed the concept too far in Russia. According to some, he drastically rearranged history and created a holiother chronology. Charlemagne turned Shinto Christ twice. The Renaissance follows the collapse of the Middle Ages. Genghis Khan even turns into a myth. However, Fenko's excesses shouldn't overshadow his underlying skepticism that history is not entirely reliable. Others also whispered. A few German scholars pointed out that several periods had no coinage. The early buildings with late styles caused architects Toskov. The eclipse inconsistencies were spotted by astronomers in private, but few were published. Why? For to question the calendar is to question the basis of history. It is heresy in academia. Cathedrals and universities, on the other hand, have long mores, but little tolerance for disturbance. You survey the study. A printed chronology of the Holy Roman rulers was displayed on one wall, a European map on another. Refer to 808. Nothing from the 7th to 9th centuries that wasn't written much later can be found over the top of the bookshelves. It raises the question of how much historical research is based on confidence. You have faith that the manuscripts are genuine, that the dates given by editors in the 19th century are accurate, and that the presumptions incorporated into archaeological dating have undergone repeated testing. What if they haven't, though? What if, like a building with a missing cornerstone, supported by habit and hope, every scholar who works honestly and quietly inherits the lie, believing that someone else has already verified it? One scholar may dare to pull on the thread, but the fabric is so large and interwoven that to question one century is to unravel them all. It's simpler to dismiss it, obstudescence, fringe, or conspiracy. However, Wood's saying, "I don't see the evidence," constitute absurdity. Is it heretical to observe that whole empires allegedly prospered in silence? From the shelf, you take out another book. The Invention of the Middle Ages is its title. Inside is a provocative phrase. According to the author, the term Middle Ages was coined during the Renaissance to put the past in a safe place. They had to think they were novel, and that all that had come before them was gloomy, unchanging, and unimportant. However, what if they were creating the timeline as well? What if the bright, aspirational, and human Renaissance scholars filled in the blanks with reconstructions, named forgotten kings, and dated ruins, using conjecture that became gospel? Recall that Pope Gregory altered the calendar in 1582. He took 10 days out of October, simply remove them. No mayhem, no riots. Time is a mechanism of permission. Thus, the world continued. Once we decide on a date, it becomes official. Could an emperor, a scholar, and a pope add 297 years? If a pope can take away 10 days, a letter from Otto causes you to hesitate. The year is 1000 when he signs it, an ideal round number, a sacred turning point. However, who would stop him if he desired 1000 and required 100 for divine legitimacy? Who would even pay attention? There was no calendar comparison among the Muslim academics. The Frankish chronicles were not being read by the Chinese historians. Only islands of record, divided by language and geography, existed. There was no worldwide coordination, and there was ample opportunity to conceal or construct a few centuries. In the silence between them, you go over Eleg's papers once again. He had no intention of destroying history. He was attempting to figure out why a lot of it had the feel of a beautifully constructed play that had been oddly practiced. a screenplay with only the final performance and no practices, and it's okay if he's mistaken, if he is even partially correct. However, the world has been living on a phantom floor for generations. Much like occupants of a house without a floor, they believe they walk on every day. You experience an odd feeling now, as though time itself is slanting beneath you, not collapsing, but simply moving to make room for a new query. What else have we unknowingly inherited? As you return to the hall of history, the study door behind you, however, something has changed. It feels different in the light, sharper but not darker, because you are no longer accidentally wandering across lost centuries. You're following the motivations, and those lines lead to power, to cathedrals, to crowns, to stone. You enter a magnificent hall with towering ceilings, singing in quiet, carved marble, stained glass, and a statue of a monarch in armor, clutching a scroll in one hand and a sword in the other. What his name is irrelevant. His type is not new. To you, three things are desired by all great leaders: legitimacy, continuity, and glory. And history is the best way to deliver all three. Consider it. Anchoring oneself to a proud past is a great approach. Tobrine, a shattered country together, as a monarch in the 10th century. Your dad was a lord. Charlemagne was served by his father. The Pope then crowned Charlemagne on Christmas. And by default, you are divine because you are his descendant. Your castle's stones are located on Roman ruins. Ancient codes are echoed in your laws. The sagas of your forefathers are written by your court poets. However, what if a large portion of that history was created out of need rather than deception? You're just a man sitting in a chair if you don't have a story. A newly crowned noble becomes the heir of 1,000 years. Invasions become divine destiny, and rulers become kings because of history. Now you enter a cloistered garden where a scribe and a bishop walk. The bishop makes a stately motion. The fact that the artifact arrived in 712 must be noted. He states, "It proves our church predates the Frankish conquest, but the relic only came this year." The scribe whispers. The bishop stops. "Yes," he replies, "but long ago, God put it here. We just located it." He grinned. The history is shifted by a breath as the scribe nods. Contrary to popular belief, this is not a conspiracy. It's not secret handshakes and maps and shady cabals. It is more bureaucratic and quieter. It is the result of opportunity and motivation coming together. A monastery fabricates a founding miracle from 678 in order to gain notoriety. Roman roots are necessary for a kingdom. It thus asserts that it is descended from a forgotten general. A pope looks for power. A papal bull is therefore backdated by him, and the chroniclers, the writers, comply. They think they are following a divine plan, not because they are dishonest. It is their responsibility to document the past as it ought to have been, not to cast doubt on it. Modern philosophers find it difficult to understand this way of thinking. These days, history is supposed to be objective, skeptical, and supported by facts. History, however, was theological in the early Middle Ages. It had a function. It indicated that God's will was coming to pass. Therefore, the lapse in time between the fall of Rome and the emergence of modern Christendom was more than just a chance. Filling it, connecting new rulers to historical glories, providing a platform for saints, and bringing prophecy into the present were all necessities. And who had the finest means to accomplish that? It was the guys with the scrolls, the scribes, not the kings or the soldiers. They weren't lying because they were greedy. They were adding what they thought should be there to the tapestry. The results were political, but the motivations were spiritual. The 1000th year after Christ, which is rife with significance, judgment, renewal, and destiny, was the year Otto III wished to dominate. However, the calendar was uncooperative. Therefore, someone forced it to comply by a press announcement, but through a few modified charters, a few updated king lists, and an updated Easter tableland, the word got out. Otto found himself at the end of a millennium when all of a sudden it was the year 1000. That stage was too strong for any ruler. How could any church reject that symbolism? Who among the historians would dare refuse? You notice it now when you pass a library. How minor changes to ancient texts became unshakable tenets of belief. The monastery was founded with a single, backdated contribution. A single misattributed text turns into the source of an entire dynasty. A calendar's root is a date that has been shifted back by a generation, and it's genuine once it's engraved in stone or replicated by enough people. Because when enough people believe in history, it becomes valuable, much like money and its beauty. 297 years didn't have to be created all at once. All they needed to do was make a few fixed points and anchors, date them, give them names, and sanctify them. Around them, everything else falls into place, like a curtain that has only 3 hooks and is allowed to hang. You go by a stained glass window that shows a saint bowing in front of a monarch. According to the caption, Anno Domini 794, another cathedral, another charter, another crown, a date you've seen before. How peculiar. What a coincidence. But not really, for history repeats its numbers, like Theckerus of a song after the plot is established. 794, 800, 84, ON 43. Every date is a significant occasion. Each one claimed validity from the others and reverberated across various events and geographies. Furthermore, the lie becomes indefensible once the echo chamber is sufficiently loud. It was helpful, not because it was malevolent. You now stand under that window with a sense of calm astonishment that the timeline you live by, the calendar that governs your birthdays, holidays, and history, is not etched into the sky. You no longer feel angry or betrayed. It was hand-carved using marble and motifs. Now you go out into the night. History is like mist on a cloak, clinging to your mind. It's quieter with the bells. The roads seem to go on forever. And one question starts to take shape in the last of the light. Not in the world of monarchs or monks, but in the profound quiet of the conscience of contemporary scholars. What if they are aware? What if historians of today, when looking through a well-preserved book from 1738, or visiting a building with architecture from the 9th century that reflects that of the 12th, archaeologists and scholars have noticed the same fissures you have and experienced the same chill of skepticism? What if they just don't say anything? Not because they are dishonest, but rather because speaking the truth is too difficult. You enter a university archive that is meticulously catalogued and climate-controlled. An 850-year-old Latin treatise was on one shelf. A dissertation that questions that date was published on the following day, but it is hardly ever cited. It is a religious treatise. You talk to a kind-eyed, gray-bearded professor. You carefully question him about the theory of phantom time. He calls it nonsense, leans back, and smiles. However, he continues, "It is still odd, isn't it? We have very little tangible proof of those centuries." Then he shifts the topic and goes on. It is impossible to ignore the deflection. He is aware, or at least he believes so, but his conferences, grants, and career all rest on a consensus that the past is where it belongs, and that the chronology is set in stone. Most people don't oppose that, since doing so would be a huge deal. Instead, they mutter, after lectures, over coffee, in footnotes that very few people ever read. Silence in the archaeological layer is unusual. A later origin is suggested by stylistic irregularities, neutral words, safe language, inconsistent epigraphy among similar sites, and several other things that go beyond the lines. A few independent researchers, who are frequently written off as fringe, dedicate their careers to gathering contradictions, cross-referencing documents, investigating mysteries, and writing little books that are hardly read. They are ridiculed because, similar to religion, history punishes heretics even when they are correct. Next, you enter a museum. Scrolls, crosses, shields, and a medieval wing. Dates are listed on the plaques with assurance and accuracy, according to stylistic comparison. Carolingian script dates from around 722 to around 781. How do we know the curator responds when you ask him? On the basis of an earlier agreement. There is no solid point on which to attach the looping chain of faith that extends from scribe to scholar consensus. Not carbon, not stratigraphy, not eyewitness. Just the weight of accumulated agreement, no North Star. You now recognize the threat, not a plot, but a system of quiet maintained by financing, professionalism, and the gradual, imperceptible strain of academic survival. You question whether our calendar is any less sacred than the stars were in the past when you consider Galileo, who was condemned for disruption as well as heresy. You go to an online archive. Although the metadata was entered by humans, thousands of manuscripts were scanned and dated. People who are depending on earlier dates, high resolution, sealed circular logic, and the spirits are still there. A poem from 775 that alludes to 11th century occurrences. Underneath floor tiles from the 10th, a king's charter dated 8 or 37 was discovered. Coins struck with stamps that were reused in subsequent centuries under the reign of Charlemagne, undisturbed, unaltered, with minor mistakes that can be forgiven and explained, but to many all at once. One academic once said, "One anomaly is an error. You remember that. 10 are a riddle, 100 is a trend, and you have to wonder if it is riskier to doubt the timeline or to act as though it is perfect when the pattern is this extensive, pervasive, and intricately woven throughout the story." The solution is obvious. It's safer to keep quiet, particularly when a calendar based on religion bears the weight of 1,000 doctorates, museum displays, and national myths. Now you are walking in a city square. The cathedral was founded in 798, according to the plaque atop it. Perhaps it was, which makes you smile. However, it may have been established in 998, 1120, or never. It might have been 798 because someone needed it. Perhaps someone had to have faith. Furthermore, as you have repeatedly observed, belief is more powerful than fact. What comes next, then? Will anyone ever acknowledge the truth? Will textbooks change? Will the redating of UNESCO plaques occur? Most likely not, because the truth is unpleasant and straightforward. A successful falsehood is easier to live with than a disastrous reality. Nonetheless, there are still those who read the shadows, fill in the blanks, and ponder not in rage or defiance, but in silent respect, what actually transpired during the years that we are unable to locate, which tales, albeit never experienced, are somehow recalled. Now the road feels softer underfoot. The toll of the bells of history is replaced by the sound of birdsong, and the grass grows thicker around the stones. You have explored cemeteries and galleries, scriptoria and starlight, palaces and ruins. However, there is only silence here. At last, at the journey's edge, in front of you is a field. No monument, no guide, no plaque to describe what it used to be. And perhaps that's the idea. For when everything is said and done, time isn't a set of dates or a list of monarchs. We keep telling ourselves this story, a tale of certainty at the start and stillness at the finish. Let's now say what few people dare to say. Perhaps history is correct. Perhaps it's simply not complete. A patchwork of faith-stitched guesses. We made timelines because we needed to think that someone had known, not because we knew. And we filled in the gaps that appeared like wounds in the record when the parts didn't quite fit, not to lie, but to maintain meaning, to construct bridges over the murky waters of years that have been forgotten. There is more to the phantom time notion than meets the eye. It serves as a mirror, reflecting how we define our position in the world. Because what else could we have believed without evidence if almost 300 years had been inserted subtly, discreetly, and with good intentions? And what else have we been given with honor? I had no idea that was planned. The monk in the tower, his quill twitching in the moonlight, is now in your memory, he says. Not what he saw, but what he was told must have happened. You recall the emperor, shrouded in prophecy, hankering after a date that seemed divine during his coronation. You recall the archaeologist wondering where the bones had disappeared while scowling at a layer of barren soil. And you recall that the stars above us are still counting, unwavering and unyielding. You grab your calendar. The date is obvious, the 5th of July, 2025. But in the back of your mind, you question whether 2025 is actually the year. Or do we inhabit a narrative whose opening chapters were composed long after the middle had been omitted? You smile because you finally comprehend the question, not because you already know the solution. That's the real meaning of history, a compass of inquiry rather than a record of assurance. You leave the field behind and start to go back, but you don't leave it empty. Because you won't instantly nod when you see a stone cross that dates back to 842, a chronicle that mentions King Louis the Pious, or a church that claims to have existed since 801. You will stop, take a deep breath, listen for the echo between your ears, and ask yourself, not doubtfully, but with awe, did it really happen, or did it just come to mind? And you will have discovered something historians hardly acknowledge, that the past is not behind us. In that tiny, hallowed pause when fact and story gently collide, it is beneath us, and it can be hollow at times, if history has always been written by the victors. then what have we never been told? Subscribe to Secret Historian, where the silence of the past is finally broken. New, hidden truths are revealed every week. Unlock the secrets before they disappear again.